This case began on an ordinary morning. The local police station received 2 calls. The police arrived at the address, but what they saw horrified them. The events that followed unfolded like a thrilling detective story, and it took 7 years to unravel the dark secrets of this strange story. Finally, after so much time, the truth of the case was revealed. But none of the victims' relatives were prepared for the shocking finale. Connie DeBate was born on July 31, 1976 in the small town of Ellington, Connecticut. She had 2 sisters and 1 brother. Since childhood, Connie showed kindness and a desire to help people, so she had many friends. It was these qualities that inspired her to pursue a career in medicine. After graduating from the University of Connecticut, she began working in sales for a pharmaceutical company. In addition, Connie became vice president of a nonprofit organization in her town that provided free emergency medical care to the public. In the early 2000s, Connie had the opportunity to fulfill her dream of having a large, close-knit family. Connie met Richard and they loved each other. The couple married on July 4, 2003, and their first son was born soon after. 3 years later, the family welcomed a second baby boy. At the same time, Connie and Richard decided to buy a new home and purchased a spacious home in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Ellington. The location was perfect for their large family. The new home had spacious rooms and the backyard had plenty of room for the kids to play. They enjoyed spending time with friends who also lived in the neighborhood. For years they had led a prosperous life, but on December 23, 2015, a terrible thing happened. On the morning of that day, the police department received 2 calls. First, a security company called to report that an alarm had gone off at Richard and Connie's home. 5 minutes later, Richard himself called the police and asked for help. Officers immediately arrived at the house where a horrific scene awaited them. One of the police officers entered through the open front door and immediately found a trail of blood leading from the basement stairs toward the kitchen. He followed the trail into the kitchen, where he discovered Richard. The man was partially bound with clamps to an overturned chair and was lying face down. There were visible wounds on his body and he had another plastic screed around his neck. A police officer called his name and Richard responded with one phrase, "He's still in the house." The police officers immediately requested additional forces and began to search both the house itself and the entire neighborhood. Immediately afterward, another gruesome discovery awaited them. When they went down to the basement, they saw Connie's body with a gun lying next to it. The detectives untied Richard, and while they waited for an ambulance, he told them what had happened that morning. Around 8:10 a.m., he drove his sons to the bus stop where they went to school, and Richard returned home. He changed into his office clothes, got in his car and drove to work. Meanwhile, Connie was getting ready for a gym class at a local charity organization. Shortly after Richard left the house, he received a notice from the security company that the alarm had gone off at his house. This was not the first time this had happened, and the cause was usually their cat, which they had left home alone. The man also realized that he had forgotten his laptop, which he needed for work, and decided to return home. Before turning back, he sent a text message to his boss that he would be late. Between 8:45 and 9:00 a.m., Richard returned to the house. When he entered the house, he heard a strange noise coming from the second floor. Cautiously, he went upstairs and entered the bedroom, where he found an unfamiliar man rummaging through the closet. Richard noticed that the perpetrator was dressed in camouflage clothing and his face was covered. As soon as the stranger saw Richard, he pounced on him and knocked him to the floor. He then demanded that he give him his wallet, bank cards and their PIN numbers. Otherwise, he threatened that he would wait for Richard's family to return and kill them. Suddenly, Richard heard the garage door open. Apparently Connie had returned early. Richard shouted, warning that someone was in the house, and ordered her to run away. The stranger headed down the stairs, but Richard tried to stop him. But the perpetrator threw Richard down the stairs and he fell to the first floor. While he was regaining consciousness, Connie ran down the stairs to the basement where the 2 guns were kept, and the criminal ran after her. Richard got up and went to the basement. There he found that the unknown man was already holding a gun, and the next second he shot Connie. The loud sound of the shot almost deafened Richard for a few minutes. He thought a second shot sounded soon after, but he wasn't sure. The killer sat Richard down in a chair and tied his hands and feet with plastic ties. He then put the gun away, took a pair of wire cutters that were in the basement, and stabbed the man several times in the body. John Doe then threw several items on the floor, took a blowtorch and began burning them in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. He then turned to Richard and pointed the blowtorch at him. Richard, who was partially tied to a chair, was able to get up and knock the blowtorch out of his attacker's hands. Richard grabbed the blowtorch and pointed it at the perpetrator, igniting the mask on his face. The perpetrator, who was unarmed, immediately ran out of the basement. Richard immediately went upstairs to call the police. As the man recounted what had happened, the police searched the house and surrounding area for several miles, but were unable to locate the suspect. The only thing they found was Richard's wallet on the front lawn. In order to find traces of the killer, the investigators called in cinematologists with search dogs. The dogs sniffed the wallet because the killer had previously held it in his hands. However, this attempt was unsuccessful. All three dogs kept bringing the detectives back to Richard. The detectives then led the dogs through the house, hoping to pick up the intruder's scent, but this too was unsuccessful. This behavior puzzled the detectives because normally trained dogs are able to detect signs of human presence even after several days. However, in this case, none of the three dogs smelled anything. Investigators also found something strange in Richard's story. According to Richard, about 5 minutes elapsed between the time he entered the house and the time the perpetrator fled. Given that Richard got home between 8:40 and 900, it should have been over by 905 at the latest. However, the security company didn't report the house alarm going off until 10:16, and Richard himself called the police shortly thereafter. It turns out that he spent more than an hour in the house before calling for help. In addition, there was too little time between Connie's departure for training and her return home. Richard was taken to the hospital, where doctors confirmed that his injuries were not life-threatening. At the hospital, detectives interviewed him again in hopes of getting a description of his attacker. Richard reported that the assailant was tall and large, but his face was obscured by the mask. Medical examiners conducted a detailed examination of Connie's body and confirmed that she had suffered 2 gunshot wounds, one in the abdomen and one in the back of the head. The detectives were stumped and continued to question Richard, hoping to get more information. But the more questions they asked, the more suspicious his answers became. Initially, the man claimed he left the house to go to work while Connie was getting ready for a workout. But at the hospital, he said he couldn't remember which one of them left first. It was also unclear to him whether the alarm had been set before he left or whether his wife had set it off. Richard also changed his version of events. First, he claimed he heard a noise on the second floor as soon as he entered the house, but now he says there was no noise and that he only noticed the perpetrator after he went upstairs and into the bedroom. The man also claimed that the perpetrator did not push him down the second floor stairs, but that he himself tripped and fell. The main contradiction, however, was the timing of the murder. Richard said he ran to the basement and saw the assailant take the gun from Connie before shooting her. However, he initially said he did not know how the assailant got the gun. In addition, the man said it was pitch black in the basement and detectives wondered how he could have seen what was happening. Richard also added that he couldn't see Connie's body because of the darkness, so he wasn't sure if his wife was dead. Another point of suspicion was Richard's wounds. They were all superficial and not threatening, but the interesting thing was that most of them were on the left side of his torso. Since the man was right-handed, and it was his right hand that was not tied to the chair, he could have inflicted these wounds on himself. In addition, there were no bruises or contusions on his body. According to Richard's testimony, he struggled with the perpetrator and fell down the stairs and should have had abrasions. However, not the slightest trace of these was found. There were traces of blood on Richard's shorts, but again there were inconsistencies with his version of events. If Richard had been injured by a sharp object while sitting in the chair, there should have been at least a few drops of blood on the bottom of his shorts. But there were no marks. The same goes for the spot in the basement where the killer stabbed Richard with the wire cutters. There should have been a lot of blood on the floor where the chair stood, but the forensic experts found only a few small drops. But that's not all. According to Richard, after the criminal fled, he came to for some time and then crawled up the stairs and from the basement to the first floor. However, there was no trace of blood on the stairs, even though the man was wounded and should have been bleeding. Another strange detail caught the detectives' attention. While investigating the crime scene, they noticed that the basement window was open. The police admitted that the killer could have entered the house through it, but there was one interesting point: the locks had been removed from the window, and from the inside. They had also been removed from the other window. To test the hypothesis, the investigators decided to try a little experiment. They tried to open the window from the outside, but they succeeded only after one of the policemen hit the frame, knocking it out and breaking the glass. This fact was the reason for the detectives' doubt that the criminal could have opened the window without locks and without the breakage of the glass. All of these circumstances led the detectives to believe that the story Richard told them might have been fabricated. Consequently, they decided to visit Richard again in the hospital and question him about possible problems in his marriage to Connie. In response, the man admitted that he had a mistress, but that Connie was aware of the situation. Based on his story, Richard claimed that he and his wife had decided to have a third child, but Connie could not get pregnant. As a result, Richard suggested the option of surrogacy, and they chose his former classmate, Rita, as a potential surrogate. Rita was recently divorced and wanted to have a child. Richard and his wife proposed the following plan to Rita: she would be the mother of Richard's child, and then they would raise the child as a threesome. Rita agreed to the proposal. They originally planned to use the medical method of fertilization, but it turned out to be too expensive. So they decided to use a more natural method, and Richard became intimate with Rita, after which she became pregnant. Richard claimed that Connie was completely on board and supported their decision. However, detectives had strong doubts about the veracity of this story, as it sounded unusual and questionable. Under pressure from the police officers, Richard changed his story about Rita. A few minutes after the previous story, he suddenly stated that in fact Connie and his former classmate had never seen each other or even communicated. He also mentioned that he wasn't sure if his wife knew about Rita's pregnancy. As his interview with the police continued, he finally admitted that he had been cheating on his wife with his former classmate for several years and that Connie was completely unaware of what was going on. Investigators contacted the woman. Rita stated that she began a romantic relationship with Richard less than a year ago. She knew he was married, but he claimed he was in the process of divorcing. The woman found out she was pregnant in June, 6 months before the incident. Richard claimed he had already hired a divorce attorney and intended to finalize the process by the time the baby was born. However, the investigation revealed that Richard had not actually contacted an attorney. In addition, everyone Connie knew claimed that she had never mentioned the divorce. All of this led detectives to consider Richard as a prime suspect. But so far, no significant evidence had been found against him, and the police began to investigate. During this investigation, they discovered some interesting facts. Close friends and relatives of the family reported that Connie often complained about the contractor, with whom they had serious problems. The work on their home had been done poorly, and the couple had tried to get some of their money back, but the contractor had been aggressive. Connie admitted that she was seriously concerned about the situation, and together with Richard, they purchased 2 guns and installed an alarm system. Investigators checked out the suspected contractor, but he had an alibi for the time of the crime. As a result of the investigation, they came back to the only suspect, Richard. For many months, the police did not reveal their suspicions about Richard as a potential murderer. All of Connie's acquaintances and relatives believed that an unknown burglar was behind the crime and sympathized with Richard. The detectives spent a lot of time talking to Connie's closest friends. They stated that Connie would definitely tell them about her husband's infidelity, especially if he had a pregnant mistress. Other family acquaintances noticed that Richard began acting strangely after his wife's death. He didn't seem depressed or upset, and just a few days after the incident, he approached several neighbors and asked, "Where do you usually order food?" The police found out that Connie and Richard were in serious financial trouble. However, Connie did not know where her money was going, while Richard was secretly spending it on his mistress. A note titled, "Why I Want a Divorce," was found on Connie's smartphone. In the note, the woman said that Richard was constantly lying, abusing her and the children, spending her money without permission, and so on. Based on this, investigators concluded that Connie herself had considered ending the marriage. But she had no idea about her husband's secret life. Upon closer examination of the financial side of the case, police discovered that just 5 days after the murder, Richard attempted to withdraw $500,000 from his wife's insurance account, but his request was denied by security. A month later, he also received a check for $75,000 from his wife's employer. These facts suggested possible self-serving motives on Richard's part, but they were not sufficient to prove his guilt. Curiously, Richard terminated his contract with the security company just 19 days after the murder. If his story about the killer's attack was true, such a move would have been illogical, as he would have put himself and his sons in danger without proper protection. Investigators got a warrant to look at all the electronics in Connie's house. And they finally found something significant. By piecing together all the information, police were able to reconstruct the exact timeline of events. At 8:44 a.m., the security system detected the garage door opening and closing. From the events that followed, investigators determined that at 8:53 a.m. that same day, Connie was captured on camera near the gym, indicating that she had gone to work out. At 8:50, Richard, who was home at the time, turned the alarm off and then turned it back on. Then, at 8:59, the man used a remote control to disable the alarm system again. Since the remote works a short distance from the system, Richard must have returned home. This is consistent with his claim that he returned to get the laptop. There was one problem. However, Richard claimed that he received a notification from the alarm on his way to work, but at that time the security system was not recording a breach, meaning that he did not receive a notification. At 9:02 a.m., Richard logged into his email from his tablet, and 2 minutes later, he texted his boss that he was going to be late because his alarm had gone off. Here is another inconsistency. Not only was there no actual notification of the alarm, but Richard also lied about sending the letter to the police. He said he sent the letter as soon as he received the notification, a few miles from home. But data from the tablet showed that he was at home when he sent the letter, because it was connected to the home's Wi-Fi. It appeared that the man had spent at least 4 minutes in the house before discovering the burglar, and everything that happened next took less than a minute, which was considered impossible. But the most important piece of evidence were the readings from Connie's fitness bracelet. She arrived at the gym at 8:53 a.m., but left after a few minutes because the class was cancelled at 9:08 a.m. The wristband stopped tracking her steps, leading investigators to conclude that Connie got in her car and drove home. The drive took 8 minutes, and that is when the fun began. According to Richard, the killer attacked his wife almost immediately after she entered the house, but the bracelet's data contradicted that. The woman walked 370 meters into her home between 9:18 and 10:17. Data from her social media account also showed that she was online for 6 minutes. In this time frame, it appears that Connie entered the house at 9:18 and was alive for almost a full hour, which was completely inconsistent with her husband's story. The important factor here was that the police were not just dealing with theoretical inconsistencies, but with actual digital evidence. It took the police more than a year to gather this detailed information, and in April 2017, they finally arrested Richard. For the vast majority of his acquaintances, this event came as a real shock. They had no idea what evidence the police had gathered and continued to see Richard as a victim. The man was charged with murder and initially wanted to set bail at $5 million, but his lawyer insisted that Richard had a clean criminal record and 2 minor sons in his care. As a result, the amount was reduced to $1 million and he immediately posted the money. Richard spent 5 years waiting for the trial to begin, as it was constantly postponed. It began only in April 2022, and during this time the man's lawyers managed to collect many interesting facts. The defense presented evidence that 6 DNA samples belonging to an unknown person were found in the house. They also pointed out that a very small amount of gunpowder was found on Richard's hands. If he was the person who shot Connie, there should have been a lot more. The prosecution refuted these arguments. The gunpowder sample was taken several hours after the man was taken to the hospital. In that time, Richard could have erased most of the evidence. As for the DNA, there was no evidence that it belonged specifically to the mystery killer. These samples could have been left by anyone who visited Richard and Connie's home at least once. In return, the prosecution presented a detailed digital map of the couple's movements that morning, which absolutely refuted all of Richard's statements. Evidence indicated that the woman died an hour after she was allegedly shot by an unknown intruder. Up until that point, she had been moving around the house and using social media as if nothing had happened. Richard's story itself also became a powerful argument for the prosecution, as the man repeatedly changed his story, and all the contradictions in his words were used as further evidence of the falsity of his stories. The trial lasted 22 days, and on May 10, 2022, the jury found him guilty. Richard was sentenced to 65 years in prison, but he continued to maintain his innocence. This trial was an ordeal for Connie's family and friends, who only learned of all the evidence against her husband during the trial itself. Until then, many of them continued to believe in the story of an unknown robber, but after all the cards were on the table, no one doubted Richard's guilt. Nevertheless, the man's lawyers have announced plans to appeal the verdict until it is reconsidered, but so far all these attempts have not brought them the desired result. As for Connie's sons, they were sent to live with their mother's relatives. They were 6 and 9 years old at the time of the murder, but the children lived with their father until the sentencing. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. I also recommend subscribing to our channel where we publish the most interesting crime stories from around the world. Thanks for watching.